What up, gunfighters? Welcome back to Gunfighter Life, where we talk about gunfighting, guns, tactics, ammo, ballistics, all manner of things, the right way, with God at the center, Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. On that real-world first-hand experience, gonna forego the lengthy bio today. I might put it in at the end, maybe not. You've probably heard it before. If this is your first rodeo here with us, go back and listen to many other episodes that have the bio in them. Today I want to get to the meat and potatoes of this podcast. Recently did an episode on the M17 versus the SIG 226. And in doing that, I thought maybe I jumped the gun a little bit. You see, not everybody, in fact nobody, popped out of their mama's womb knowing the difference between a striker fire and a hammer fire and many other different aspects of guns, right? We all learned it along the way, and I think for those of us that grew up with guns and hunting and shooting, we maybe forget how much we've learned, maybe how much we've forgotten over the years. There's so much in this topic. So I thought I'd take a step back and maybe discuss the fundamental differences. You've gotten into guns recently in this gun culture 2.0, and pretty much all you've known is polymer striker-fired handguns. Why? Where did they come from? How did they get here? How do they compare to hammer-fired guns in general? Welcome to the gun culture. Let's get into today's topic. I am going to start discussing something seemingly unrelated. But hang in there. We'll get around to it and hopefully it makes sense. If we look at a machine gun, now as far as I know, and I'm not a historian, as far as I know, the first mass adopted, commercially successful, battlefield, used machine gun, like we would think of it today, not a Gatling gun, but like a belt-fed, rapid-fire, metallic cartridge machine gun. The Maxim gun. If you look at the Maxim gun, it's pretty complex in how it operates. If you look at everything that goes into a Maxim gun, the water-cooled barrel, the fairly complex operating mechanism, precision machining that goes into making all that work. It's a really cool gun, especially for its time. Kind of a game changer in warfare. However, if you compare that to a wildly successful, let's call it medium machine gun today, 240 Bravo, 240 Golf, depending on your branch of service or whatever, the 240. You look at those two guns side by side, the 240 is, I'm going to go ahead and say, a much simpler, more reliable gun. That's kind of how we see gun development over time. We see it in rifles. We see the AK wildly successful, battlefield proven, reliable. And a lot of that has to do with its simplicity. There were select fire / fully automatic kind of rifles before it that fired rifle cartridges. Wasn't really groundbreaking in those areas. It's really groundbreaking in its simplicity. That's kind of the genius of the AK-47. It's about as simple as you can make a repeating high-pressure intermediate cartridge gun. And part of that simplicity lends to its reliability, its ruggedness. We see that same kind of firearms development. This is where it comes back around. Thanks for listening to that. We see the same thing in semi-automatic handguns. If you look at some of the really early ones, a Mauser broom handle, a Borchardt, and probably most notably the Luger. Luger's a great gun. I got a chance to shoot one of those and I was dinging a head plate at 25 yards with this old Luger that somebody let me shoot. Amazing. Amazing that gun still worked. And it was accurate and reliable, especially for the time. But if you look at the amount of machining and hand fitting and complexity in a Luger, it's remarkable in that they got it to work with that design. And that's really cool and for its time revolutionary. But if you compare a Mauser broom handle or a Borchardt or a Luger to a Glock 17, again you see the same thing. The Glock 17 is remarkably simple. I don't know how many moving parts are in a Luger, but I'm thinking it's much, much more than the moving parts in a Glock 17. We see the development over time toward simplicity and rugged reliability. And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about next. Now, Glock wasn't the first polymer handgun. It wasn't the first striker-fired handgun or weapon. It wasn't the first at any of those things, but much like the Maxim, it was the first really commercial, successful, mass-adopted polymer striker-fire. There were others, H&K, but unarguably nowhere near as successful as the Glock family, starting out with the Glock 17. And what really revolutionized it, and what I think Gaston Glock, not to put words in his mouth, but from what I understand about Glock and the development of Glock, he wasn't out to make the most exquisite shooting experience in a handgun. He wasn't out to win USPSA competitions. He wasn't out to build the most accurate handgun. He, from a manufacturing standpoint, looked at how to make a handgun simply, affordably, and function reliably. And at that, I don't think you can fault him. Polymer frame, very, very simple. I compare it to like the AK of the handgun world, right? It's about as simple and rugged as reliable as you can make a handgun. You could argue today there are other designs that are just as rugged and simple and reliable, and I would make that argument. But really, Glock, I don't think anybody does it simpler and more rugged than Glock. And that was that end goal, and I think that end goal was accomplished. The striker-fired polymer handgun is cheap to produce. It's very simple. There's not a lot to go wrong with it, especially if you compare that to like a Luger, for instance, or many other designs that came before it, even a 1911. I like 1911s. I carried 1911s, 2011s as a professional gunfighter. I like them. I will not make the argument that they are as rugged and forgiving of maintenance, and certainly not as cheap to manufacture and produce as a Glock. We have to look at what they were trying to do. If you look at the amount of moving parts, and again, the 1911 for its day, and still today, a phenomenal handgun. But look at the amount of moving parts in a 1911 versus, again, a Glock 17. And I'm not saying that the Glock is a better handgun than the 1911. Many would, but I wouldn't. Many would argue that the 1911 is a better handgun than the Glock. I can see that point of view, but I'm not here to argue that. I'm here to say, look at it soberly. They were meant for different things. One was meant for mass adoption, mass issue, a cheap to produce, rugged, reliable, mass issue handgun. If you compare that to what I might consider the opposite end of the spectrum, an STI or today Staccato 2011. Much more complex, much more fitting and finishing required. But that's not the end goal. The goal of that, I believe, for Staccato STI is to get arguably one of the most shootable handguns. Very accurate. Very fast. As in cycle time, shot recovery time. Very shootable from an end user standpoint. Great ergonomics. I don't know anybody, unless they're just dyed-in-the-wool Glock drinking the Kool-Aid, that would grab a Glock and say it has great ergonomics. It has the ergonomics of a 2x4. But again, that's not the goal. The goal wasn't to make the most ergonomic gun. The goal was to make a gun cheaply, reliably, mass issue. You look at the Staccato, way better ergonomics. Way more shootable. Way better trigger. Way more accurate. That was the goal. But you give up that rugged reliability. If you said, I don't care, I'm not going to master the handgun, I'm not going to take the time to do that, I want a handgun for whatever I want it for. I want it for really adverse conditions. I want the handgun that I'm most likely to be able to throw into a porta potty for a month, come back, pee on it, and be able to shoot it. Then, yeah, the Glock is going to be a better option for that than your 2011. If you want to dedicate to the craft of being a good shooter, to use the talents you've been given by God and develop them to be a good, even master handgun shooter, then you're going to want the STI 2011. They're meant for different purposes. Now, you can shoot really good and really quick and accurately with a Glock, but in general, it takes modification. You are modifying it from its original design to more specialized purpose. And a lot of times when you do that, ask anybody who's been a professional armorer, who's been professionally employed for armory work, myself included. A lot of times when Glocks have problems, it's when people modify them from the original. But they're doing that, so they're trying to go from that. They're trying to start from that end of the spectrum and gravitate more towards a more shootable one. They shoot a couple other guns and they say, wow, this Glock trigger is like dragging a piano down a gravel road. I want a better trigger. And they put in a better trigger. But usually that will result in a less reliable gun, even on a high-end trigger. Times they'll go with lighter springs, lighter striker springs, which again yields a more shootable platform, but can often lead to a less reliable ignition. And it's up to you how much trade-off you want to go to. And a lot of times you're talking about small amounts. Let's say it malfunctions once every 1,000 rounds. You do some modifications and it malfunctions 3 out of every 1,000 rounds. Maybe that's an acceptable amount of risk for you. But you're starting from that point. So why do striker-fired handguns exist, and why do they take up such a big chunk of the market? So let's step back and ask ourselves, why? They're cheap to produce. Let's just be honest. I know what you might pay for them, and this might anger you, but it is what it is. But the M17, which is basically the military's version of the 320, which in my experience on working on them and doing gunsmithing stuff is quite a bit more complex than a Glock 17. Got more parts, got more things that there's more going on there. It's more complicated than the Glock 17. However, the military got those, I think, for $209. And I've heard that from more than one source, but verify that for yourself. The military gets that entire gun for $209. You're probably not making a reliable 1911 for $209. They're cheap to produce. And I'm not ragging on it. What am I carrying today? I was just dry firing. I was going back and forth between guns. My two main carry guns, the SIG 226 and the M17. I'm carrying the M17. It's that very gun. But it's made for $209 by SIG, sold to the military. It's cheap to produce, right? It's cheap to produce. It's lightweight, it's plastic as far as the frame goes. It's designed for mass issue, in this case, to the military. You're talking to somebody that served in 2 branches of the armed forces, went to war for this country a couple of times. But the military, a lot of times, buys its armament to the lowest bidder, to the cheapest bidder. And I would argue, of all the things the U.S. government and military spends money on, the infantryman's rifle and sidearm is not a place to cut corners, but it still gets chalked up to the same thing, right? The lowest bidder. Why is the military going to spend money on a more elegant shootable gun when they can get something good enough for a couple of $100s? And that's what they do. That's what it was designed for, just like Glocks. I've said this many times as somebody that served as a peace officer, L.A.P.D. I worked regular assignments, I worked fugitive recovery. I was issued a Glock. I went to other things later, but cops are not gunfighters in general. Some can be, and some specialized units can really be into gunfighting, but your average general purpose police officer, a lot of them, from my experience, don't even really care about guns. They have that job for the pension because of whatever their personal reasons are, and I'm not putting that down, but that doesn't make them a gunfighter. You might qualify some good departments every other month. If you told me you were really into fitness and you worked out once every other month, how fit would you be? Same with gunfighting. It's a perishable skill, especially handgun. Rifle, not so much. Handgun is a perishable skill. For a general purpose mass issue, if a department is buying, when I was L.A.P.D, it was 9,000 and something officers. I think it's more than that now. If you're doing a mass issue, you want something that's good enough. The vast majority of your police officers are not going to be gunfighters. They need something to go bang, and it's easy to maintain, and it's cheap to produce and issue. That's your polymer striker-fired handgun. That's why they exist. You look at a specialized unit inside L.A.P.D, the SIS, they carry 1911s. They carry Kimber, or I don't know if they all do, but they have an edition of a 1911. Why? Specialized unit, not very big. So you can go absolutely crude, easy, cheap to produce, and reliable. But I think you can swing that pendulum so far that you give up shootability. You give up ergonomics. You give up elegance and speed. And you're talking to somebody that's won more shooting competitions than I can remember with a striker-fired handgun, because I competed in production division, because that's what I carried as a cop. And that made sense. And you have to realize about most shooting competition disciplines, USPSA for instance, make their own divisions for these striker-fired guns because they can't compete shootability-wise with hammer-fired guns. If they did, they wouldn't need their own division. And you can, especially at local matches, do okay with like a highly modified Glock in these divisions. But again, highly modified, you're taking away that ruggedness and cheap to produce cost of the Glock and adding aftermarket stuff to it to get it more towards the other end of the spectrum. What do you want? This is gunfighter life. Maybe just getting started. Maybe your budget is for a gun and ammo and whatever else, holster, mags, one gold Cougarand. I try and stay away from dollars a lot because of inflation. You might listen to these a year from now and the prices may double. Go up by 50% or quadruple like the price of eggs this past year. Who knows? But, gold is a lot more stable. So let's say you have one gold Cougarand to be invested in this handgun world. So you're talking just a few things. Gun, ammunition, belt, magazine, and hopefully training. Yeah. Absolutely get an inexpensive but effective polymer striker fired handgun, spend the money on the ammo and the training, because a more shootable platform absolutely makes a difference. But you're going to see so much more gain if you dedicate yourself to actually getting out and practicing and dry firing and getting training than you would with, a Glock versus a staccato. Whereas if you're a really fast draw, and still own a stock factory Glock, and I still own an STI 2011. My first shot time, my draw time on a given target, let's say 7 yards, maybe 0.7 seconds with the staccato, maybe 0.8, probably pretty close to what it would be on a USPSA silhouette. Just trying to get a hit on the silhouette, I'm not talking A-zone. Yeah, it might be a tenth faster. And it's probably pretty similar for you, a tenth faster. But if you spend the time in training on the ammo and dedicate yourself to the dry fire and get actual training, you're probably going to go from a 2.5 second draw to a 1.5 second draw. So the tenth of a second difference there is less germane to you than the second you're going to save by investing that money in training. Now, you will get to a point, I think, if you dedicate yourself to the handgun discipline, where you can hold yourself back with a gun that's meant for the wrong purpose. I was blessed to be the commander of a tactical team, and I wrote the policy, literally wrote the policy for that unit, and I let them carry what they could qualify with within reason, like they weren't carrying like a Desert Eagle, right? A practical combat handgun. I would let them carry what they wanted to carry that they shot well, and they had to pass the qual. And this was not like a random police qual that is just like check the box. Like, it was a hard qual. People lost their job over the qual. We were professional gunfighters. We weren't general purpose police officers. That said, I think, in my opinion, watching them, and as somebody who is an F.B.I. firearms instructor, an N.R.A. instructor, Marine Corps urban warfare instructor, and an advanced weapons instructor for a 3-letter government agency I won't specify. Who knows how many military, police, and civilians I've taught. From that gathering of information, I believe that a lot of them were held back because they had drank the Glock Kool-Aid, and they would have shot better if they'd have went to a different gun. Because, Glocks are so mass issue, they think that that's the best gun out there. When they get to a point, and we trained a lot, like you might go through a over 2,000 round course in a week. They would get to a point of proficiency where I think literally the gun was holding them back, because I got to that point personally, where I could outshoot a Glock. The Glock was holding me back. I don't care how fast and how well you can manipulate a Glock trigger. If you have less with time and grit and mushiness to navigate, you can manipulate that gun faster and more accurate, which is kind of the point of gunfighting, right? Fast, accurate. I think the pendulum can swing too far that way. May the Glock go 100,000 rounds without cleaning? Yeah, sure. I would not count on my STI 2011 to do that. However, is that germane to what we were doing? I'm talking about we were working a CONUS operation, continental U.S., in a fairly clean environment, a metropolitan area to stop active shooters. What scenario am I shooting 100,000 rounds without cleaning my gun? My general thing was I would clean my STI about every 250 rounds. I would go more than that, reliably. But why not clean it every 250 rounds? And I've said this before, maybe controversial. If you know how to tune your gun and maintain your gun, a good, well-tuned 1911 or 2011 can be every bit as reliable in those parameters as a Glock. Again, I'm not planning on throwing it in a porta potty and coming back a month later. Talk about, I was also a private contractor. If you talk about that kind of stuff in a nasty, dirty desert environment, rolling around, maybe hand-to-hand combat in the sand, yeah, the Glocks can come ahead on that. That's not what we're talking about here. What are the parameters you're looking for? I think a lot of those men would have been better served with, even if they didn't want to spend the money on an STI 2011, let's say a CZ75. If a good mix, right? A good reliable service handgun, better ergonomics, in my opinion, better shootability, faster shot recovery time. In general, a good hammer-fired. A mediocre single-action hammer-fired gun is going to be better than a really good striker-fired gun. If hitherto you have only ever shot a polymer striker-fired handgun, because that's what you know, and every time you watch some YouTube gun guy there, Glock, polymer striker fire this. Actually try out and go shoot a single-action hammer-fired gun. Do it on the clock. Do it and test your shot recovery times, your split times, because what are you trying to do? Perhaps the reason that gun exists is not most applicable to you. Perhaps you need to step back from that pendulum swinging to the crudest, simplest, most affordable we can make a mass issue handgun to something a little bit more elegant. You might get a little bit more complexity. You may have a little bit more fine-tuning of, the sear and the hammer. You may have to change your mainspring every 1,000 rounds on a 1911 versus every 5,000 rounds on a Glock. But, is that a big deal to you? Can you spend $9 every 1,000 rounds, every, case of ammo? Say, okay, I'm just going to make my Wilson Combat, buy 10 Wilson Combat springs. Every time I buy a case of ammo, I'm going to buy a $10, and whatever the cost is when you listen to this, right? A very affordable, the fraction of the cost of one box of 50 rounds of ammo every 1,000 rounds. I'm just going to get a new spring. No big deal. Decide, nope, I'm not going to do that. But if you're looking for a good, shootable, more elegant gun, if your goal is a great shooting experience, accurate, fast split times, better ergonomics, better balance, then perhaps don't look at a gun that was built to the lowest bidder. Something like a 1911 at first, if you're talking about the original 1911 model, was designed to be a combat effective, rugged for the time handgun. But its development over time, I think, for most of the modern ones today, has gone towards the other end. It's gone towards more shootability, better ergonomics, like a beaver tail, really good sights, really good balance, really good fit and finish and lockup. You look at not even a crazy expensive, but a decent 1911 on the market today, which is an original 1911, the lockup, the slide to frame fit and things like that, I'm going to go out and say are going to be far better. It's been developed for a different purpose, for shootability, for ergonomics. And I'm not telling you that one is better than the other. I'm saying, what is your purpose? You may decide still Glock is the best option for you. You may decide you're happy with being a good, competent, decent handgun shooter. and you want to do a legitimate amount of training, both yourself and get professional training, to be competent and stay competent. You're not worried about ringing out fast split times. You're not going to try and shoot past 25 yards. And I'd say good on you for being a well-armed citizen. I'd say that's fine. Decide you want a Glock because Glock, and you're the kind of person that doesn't generally maintain your guns and like that rugged, reliable aspect of it. I'd say that's fine. Choose a Glock. But what I'm saying is I think many people just go with Glock or something like that for the wrong reasons. What pertains to you? What are you trying to do? What's important to you? We're blessed to kind of live in the golden age of handguns. There are so many more options today, even than when I started, let's say, being a professional gunfighter in the early 2000s, in the early aughts. So many more options today. Have a vast selection of things that you can choose. What are the parameters? I think a lot of people get sucked in and they choose stuff or don't choose stuff based on myth or things that don't apply. A classic one is somebody I recently, that's a listener, asked me about the Beretta. And I like the Beretta as a combat handgun. I really do. I've carried one of those as a professional gunfighter. I think they're an exquisite gun, and they really have a good balance of shootability, in my opinion, shootability, ergonomics, if you get rid of the safety, which you can easily on a G model, and reliability. And they asked, well, what about back in the day when they had cracked frames? Yeah, they did. When people shot Uzi machine gun ammo designed to be shot out of shoulder-fired weapons that were loaded way hotter than what that gun was rated for. Yeah, when they shot thousands of rounds of that, some of those frames cracked. That's a real thing. Does that apply to you? Are you shooting, Israeli submachine gun ammo out of your Beretta 92 for carry? I mean, but a lot of people might let that stop them because back in the 90s, people got a hold of, surplus crates of that ammo. For whatever reason, they thought that was good ammo, and they ran it through their guns and they cracked it. Even on that, Beretta came out with, improved locking blocks and things like that. But does that even apply to you? Shooting thousands of rounds of the submachine gun ammo. So that doesn't apply. That's just an example. Going back to the 1911. The 1911 requires more maintenance. And I'll say, yeah, that's true compared to a Glock. If you're the kind of person that keeps your gun relatively clean, again, does it matter that you could shoot a Glock 100,000 rounds without cleaning it? And you probably legitimately could. I wouldn't advise it, but does that apply to you? Are you going to do that? Or are you going to clean your gun every 250, 500 rounds? Then a 1911 is probably just fine. Not like a 1911, every time you pull the trigger, you have to clean the gun. You're talking, in my experience, several hundred rounds before you even start to see any kind of issue. Again, does that apply to you? You may decide yes. You may decide I like going to training classes and I might go and shoot 2,000 rounds in this training class. I've been there. Of our training classes, just the weekly round count was over 2,000 rounds. And you're like, I want to do that and I don't want to clean my gun. I want to go at the end of the day and get some sleep, go out and get beer and pizza or whatever you do, as long as you're sober the next day to go shooting. Whatever your thing is, I want to throw that Glock in a bag and I don't want to think about it. Then yeah, that's a design parameter that is important to you, that is germane to you. Because in a training class with thousands of rounds, you're not going to clean your gun. That's not you. If you're like, at the end of the day, I'm going to go to the hotel room and clean my gun, then that doesn't really apply to you. And in gunfight, I don't care what it is, what situation are you going to shoot hundreds of rounds in real-world defensive scenarios where you can't clean your gun? Hundreds of rounds, thousands of rounds. Right, so for that, I don't even think it's a consideration. Anyway, just some thoughts. God's blessed me with a lot of training and experience. I'm trying to pass that on. You may not agree with me. You may totally disagree with me. I'm trying to bring you my thoughts and opinions, and some of them very much are opinions, but based on real-world first-hand experience. Again, you choose whatever handgun you think suits you best, but don't choose it based on irrelevant mythology or parameters that don't apply to you. Look at it soberly, circumspectly. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this episode. If it made you think, if it made you realize a few things, if you value this content, please consider becoming a patron. Unlike a lot of other things, I don't take sponsors here. I don't have some gun company telling me to tell you to buy this gun because it's the next latest, greatest polymer striker fire thing. If I think a gun is a good gun, I'll tell you. If I think it's a junk gun, I'll tell you. And nobody's paying me to do otherwise. If you value that content, and more importantly, if you think this is a podcast and a ministry, right? The prime directive of these podcasts are to make godly men strong and strong men godly. Let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. Jesus, Gospel of Luke. If that's a thing you want to support, consider becoming a patron. You shall not muzzle the ox while it treads out the grain. Anyways, thanks for listening to all this. I'm going to give you the tactical tip of the day and the tactical verse of the day. A tactical tip of the day, and when I got thinking about it, it actually kind of epitomizes what we're talking about here. I pulled off my hip an M17. This is a SIG M17, and this is a SIG factory 17 round magazine. Do you hear that fine craftsmanship? I don't carry this gun generally with the SIG factory magazine in it because it sounds like you're kicking a can full of rocks down the road. As somebody that's done fugitive recovery and likes to do handgun hunting, right? I don't want to sound like a baby rattle walking through the woods or even down the street. Talk about concealed carry. So here's my solution to that problem. I have a Pro Mag aftermarket magazine, which I've taken and filed the sides down so that it still inserts quickly and rapidly and locks in place, but it doesn't wiggle. I mean, it wiggles much less. I don't know if you can even hear that, but it's very quiet compared to the SIG Factory magazine. And this is not unique to me. I got a hold of did a survey in the tribe, and it came up again. Yes, in fact, that's a real thing with the SIG 320 M17s. They rattle, which I'm not a big fan of. But again, what was it made for? If you're in a firefight next to a machine gun on a battlefield, that's probably not going to be that relevant. To me, I don't want a rattly gun. So that just kind of talks about that. But if you want that, get the Pro Mag. It comes with these little wings on the base plate. I file them down to they're still snug, but they insert a little bit better than just a straight factory mag does. You have to give it some force. And maybe you like that, but I want it to seat quickly and reliably, but not rattle. The Pro Mag is a good option for that. But just comparing that to like an STI, those mags have a lot of taper. They insert quickly. Most of them come with a magazine well, so it's fast reloads. And they don't rattle. Again, what are you trying to do? What's the end goal? That's your tactical tip of the day. It may apply to more guns than just that SIG M17 or 320, but it's a pretty popular platform, so you may give that some thought. The tactical verse of the day. The words of Jesus, the Gospel of Luke, and not let he who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. We already talked about that. When Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, which think about that theologically and chew on that. But Jesus answered and said to him, "It has been stated, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test." It's up to you to not do anything reckless and then try to preserve your life, and if you care about loving your neighbor as yourself, not only protecting you, but protecting those around you, loving your neighbor as yourself. It is also written, you shall not stand idly by while somebody takes the life of your neighbor. And there's a couple other different translations of that, but are you your brother's keeper? I once got asked that by a master gunnery sergeant, Marine Corps master gunnery sergeant. Are you your brother's keeper? And I wasn't a Christian at the time. I grew up a heathen. And that's a deep theological thing to chew on as well. But if you're going to carry a gun, which I encourage you to, if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. That's what Jesus said, so obviously that's what I encourage. If you're going to carry that gun, do not put the Lord your God to the test. Be competent with it, train with it, be proficient with it. Don't put the Lord your God to the test. My God is my shield, my high tower, my refuge. The Lord is our refuge and strength. Don't put him to the test. Do your due diligence. He gives us talents to use them. There's a whole parable about the talents and the people that are given the talents, and that's a monetary thing, but you can extrapolate that to actual talents. They were given different amounts of talents, The ones that used them well were commended, and the ones that didn't develop them and multiply them were chastised. Use the talents you've been given. Develop them. They're gifts from God. With that, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.